Thank you very much, Joe, and a warm welcome to everybody. Joined with me today, I've got Jeff Buttigieg, CEO of Remax in Malta, bringing insights from the real estate market. I'm also joined by George Dabono, the Chief Commercial Officer at BNF Bank. We'll be looking at obviously the financial aspects and the financing side, the purse strings of investment. Denise Schwirep also joins us. She's the director at AX Group and vice president of the Malta Developers Association, so close to the construction sector and also close to the broader Development Association reach. And there's also Andre Pizzuto, managing architect at Design Principal and president of the Camera del Periti, bringing in then the perspective from the architectural side of things. So a real rich panel. Thank you very much all for joining. And in fact, you get also probably the honor of being amongst the first who I'm sure will be tackling the impact or the overcast and grey discussion that hit yesterday and its effect on the property market. We will, however, touch upon that later, because as a start, I mean, I would like us to first focus on, what was on, and then we'll overlay the developments of yesterday into the conversation. And just to set the scene, I thought of sort of lifting our head up a bit from the hustle of our 316 square kilometer rock and share some insights from the recent Global Real Estate Conference that KPMG held in April of 21. And over there, what was interesting and which we can relate then to our local context was that some commentators were pretty surprised at how values had managed to retain certain stability. Yes, there was certain swings in the retail market and also in the office space environment. But the rebound was stronger than anticipated, and also in the residential market, there was quite an attractive performance of growth, which sort of surprised a number of participants. There is also growth expected in the next 24 months. So certain commentators said this, and there were a number of structural shifts that had pre-existed COVID that basically were accelerated by COVID in the real estate sector. And possibly there are parallels to what we saw in the local market, where, aided as well by government incentives, the disruption to the market appears to have been contained. Maybe in the rental market is where we saw most of the fluctuations going on. But sales seem to have continued, and we'll get into that shortly. There are other, however, aspects coloring the property market internationally, such as upward pressures on the horizon for interest rates, maybe, as inflation may nose up. And there are also other financing matters which we'll be speaking to George about that are hitting our local shores, new developments on financing. And if we had to look at certain trends, for example, within the European region, then there's some takeaways that sort of, I'm sure, will color thinking on the future of our local market, such as, research would show that in towns and cities in the UK, there's an expectation that between 27% to 11% of commuter footfall will be lower in towns and cities, so cities holding a bit stronger. So hence retail may be expected to suffer more in the towns rather than the city centers, which have the pedigree of attracting the key or the bulk of the shopping community. And also in terms of office spaces as well, there was a bit of a softening in the market, but again, it wasn't as strong as maybe anticipated, and the recovery appears stronger. But there will be some interesting points to share in terms of office space. Why? Because, for example, in the US, it's being foreseen that workers will be spending maybe 36% of the time remote working, up from 16%. So expectations of maybe 2 days versus the previous 1 day a week on average working remotely. So what could that mean? Could it end up by pushing trends towards more of a focus of collaborative spaces in offices, seeing that role may be more important? There'll be a more maybe educational, more transfer of knowledge, more meeting and collaboration needs to be fulfilled by the office. Also, some of the key lessons that were deemed to be learned through these pandemic times, where when one saw how the digital transformation really accelerated. There was talk before, but it really has taken on, and it's also changing the experience expected by users, even obviously of property. There was also interesting takeaways on how resilient and agile companies have to be. And Nobody anticipated the event and the scale of its impact. And I think what it showed is that, companies can adapt, would need to adapt, and as well their own arrangements and their own setups, physical footprint would also need to adapt with it. There's also an interesting lesson which could be also relevant to Malta in two ways, and we'll extend later, in terms of how agile government intervention and can leave a positive impact. If you look at the impact of this pandemic on a number of countries, many argue how contained it was because of the forceful intervention that governments have made, very focused and well-timed interventions. There may, however, be trends or pushes for higher corporate tax rates, and obviously there's on the international dimension, but it could also affect obviously Malta. And I think it's very evident of how interconnected our world is. So think tourism, think supply chain. I mean, those really were impacted by the inability to be traveling and moving around. There has also been a lot of developments on the environmental, social, and governance front, or ESG. So a lot of growing push towards green, and maybe also motivated by people stopping or slowing down their pace and thinking really of what matters. And also regulators pushing for ESG. So some markets estimate between 26% of assets under management worldwide are under some form of sustainability lens. And let's remember, Malta forms part of EU, and the European region seems to be really keen to be taking an intellectual lead on this area. So I'm sure it's important for us to keep close and also leverage this lead that one is trying to achieve within Europe. That said, we are far from a harmonized framework within the ESG setup. So, this could mean that in the first instance, there'll be a lot of data gathering, a lot of reports and filings, and that could maybe give it a bit of a negative twist as to what this ESG could mean about. But I'm sure, even our panelists will share their thoughts on how this could impact the property sector. In truth, one way to think about is that it could impact because customers, the ultimate users of property, would obviously be pushing more and would be giving more interest in terms of the E and the S and the G angles of the properties they use. So travelers, tourists looking at the hotel properties they're visiting and their ESG credentials, employees looking at their offices and their ESG credentials, and also shoppers looking at the functions and the setup of the retail malls that they are visiting. And finally, it is really a dynamic space. For example, we're seeing that back in August, 69% of CEOs had, for example, indicated that they intended a statement they will be downsizing their physical footprint. But then you roll forward only to April, and you see that now only to March, actually, end of March, and you see that only 17% are saying that. I doubt 50% have implemented their plans, but it shows that as we start to look to find our new reality, new facts, new insights come in, and one continues to readjust their plans. So a lot is happening on the property sector. With that said, I turn to our panel, and I was going to kick off actually with you, Jeff. We present a bit of a flavor of what's going on in the international scene, and maybe what if we could bring it a bit close to the local scene. What patterns have you witnessed in the residential and the commercial and real estate market, and where's it heading?
Yeah. Okay. Well, firstly, when the COVID hit in March, I think the only two lull months we had were April and May. June was probably one of our best months in the last 2 years. And then we carried on steady growth throughout the year. In fact, we had a great, in the last quarter, the first quarter of this year, I'm talking residential, we doubled in transactions compared to the same quarter last year, and we doubled in volume. That obviously doesn't, this is my company, so it's not industry. We don't have national statistics, so I can only speak from what our company's performance. But what we did see is obviously a lull in the rental market. We saw, I believe, commercial was one of the most hit because people were actually moving out of their office space, giving up their office space during this period. But funny enough, what we're seeing now is that since the vaccine started coming in and moving forward, we've seen a huge resurgence of companies wanting to bring back their staff because they would have sent or made redundant a number of staff, or staff would choose to go back to where they come from to weigh out the period. So now they're calling in for them to come back. So I mean, from the top of my mind, I think there would be about 700 people that I know from different companies that are coming back to Malta from various industries such as gaming, software, etc., etc. So that's what's happening. I mean, from a residential perspective, what we've seen hugely is a major demand in outdoor space, whether it's a balcony, whether it's a terrace. We've also seen people wanting to live in village houses where they can have a courtyard. There's been a bigger demand for these type of properties, and villas, of course. Villas, I don't think we've had such a demand for the last 3 years for villas, with pool, with garden, with outdoor space. A lot of people want studies because during that period it was tiring because you're trying to work, you have your kids on one side, your mother-in-law on the other side, and it was a bit crazy for most of us until we adapted it to the situation. I mean, those are the trends we saw. Let me just see, because I have some notes here. Yeah, I mean, from a business perspective, what I can see is we continue going, even though that there's mention of this. We have the gray listing coming up. Well, it's here, but I think if we give service, if we promote the brand, Malta brand, and agencies wake up and start, improving what they're doing and sets a standard of service, because without the standard of service, people will, we will not be as attractive. So buildings have improved, quality of buildings, the infrastructure, I believe, has improved hugely. But also estate agents need to up their game. Now we have the licensing, which is coming into place in the beginning of next year. Doesn't necessarily that's going to standardize a service, because it's basically, the licensing is more of a technical thing. I believe there should be a service standard, like we're implementing at the moment within our company, where we're, you need to reply to a client within a certain amount of time. You need to put in a property within a certain amount of time. These are not standardized in the industry. So what we have is, sometimes you can call them cowboys, you can call them not regulated to an extent because they don't know better. But if you look at research, the better the service, the better product we can give as an agent, the more you will withstand any kind of crisis that there might be. And COVID was a pure example, because during the lockdown, we did a lot of training. We introduced virtual tours first. We started doing Zoom calls and showing properties on Zoom calls. We went digital complete, and we taught our agents how to use digital, because that's what's important. We got foreign experts come in to Malta, well, not into Malta, but on Zoom, showing them how to use equipment, how to do, and we just need to adapt. So so that's me.
No, I think, Jeff, you've touched on a number of themes. I actually took note, and we'll connect on the aspect of standards, raising the game, innovation, digital. So in a way, a number of themes seen globally, once again, like many other things, equally touch our and impact our shows, even if we are a small rock. And I'll move a bit onto Denise. So Jeff is gave the perspective of the real estate market and agency views, but you've had to move a bit closer to the construction sector, bearing in mind, Denise, that you'll be seeing what's coming down the pipeline could hit the road in a few years time. So are you seeing any particular changes? If yes or no, why?
Thank you. Thanks, David. Just to continue a little bit on what Jeff was saying on the office market, I believe that the office will return. So I think that we will have to change our type of offices, the way we plan our offices. But the office environment, I think that even locally, at first, everyone thought that we'll keep working remotely. But then as soon as staff started to re-enter into the office dynamic is still very important. There will definitely be much more flexibility, more importance on the communal spaces and the interaction between the staff, more hot desking. So I think on that aspect, we will be seeing the office market, yes, will definitely remain, but we will see a change in the type of offices that we will be building and renting out. I mean, as we saw also in COVID on property, what we saw on sales mostly there was a shift in the internal market. So people took on the incentive that there was, the government incentive on property sales, to change their current property and possibly improve, maybe add another bedroom, add an outdoor space, as Jeff was saying. So I think these dynamics, we will continue to seeing them during COVID, because I wouldn't say we're post-COVID yet. So so I think we'll continue to see that. In terms of construction, a lot is happening. There are a lot of discussions underway in terms of change in regulation. I always like to define the process of construction versus the finished product. So at the moment, even in discussions, there are a lot of discussions between MDA, KTP, BICC, and BCA. I like to distinguish the construction, so the act of building, that is a temporary process, versus the finished product, the building, the use of a building, whether it is a home, whether it is an office, hotel, or whatever, or be it the end use. On the construction elements, so the first part of the lifetime of the building, there is a lot, as I said, happening in terms of change in regulations. Licensing of contractors is currently being discussed, the building codes, the construction codes. My hope, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that shares the sentiment on this panel, is that we hope that the newly launched Building and Construction Authority will have the resources available to take on and implement this change, because it's a big change that we will be seeing. And I think it's up to us as stakeholders that we make sure that this transition is done cleverly, because we need to regulate, but we need to regulate it in a controlled manner, because if we do not, then this is going to end up increasing and skyrocketing also the costs to build. I don't believe that implementing the changes will necessitate a big increase in the construction costs, but we have to do it cleverly. I mean, a party that the construction costs are also increasing because of what is happening globally. So raw materials prices are increasing, labor shortage, that is definitely a reality that we will be facing. But in terms of construction methodologies, although we have improved our technique and our building finished product, I think we still have a lot to work on in terms of implementing and introducing green buildings, and how we will obviously go about that. But I think there is also, in terms of finished product, a gap in the market of what we build. So we have the top end, high quality developments, and then there is also the low end. And I think we need to, which possibly can be termed a substandard. So I think we need to balance the way we build, and hopefully the introduction of the construction regulations, the construction codes, and the building codes will help level that out into having a homogeneous and a good standard of development.
Very interesting. That is, I mean, both yourself and Jeff, lots of mention of standards and raising quality. So maybe interesting time to shift to Andre. Andre, can key stakeholder of the architectural profession. Many times, it feels, even listening to and reading thought pieces from architects, you sense that conflict or that being torn between the professional calling to bring enhancements to our local built-up environment, but then the actual attitude that regulation, to mention one, economic demands, and even indeed what ultimately the client requests allow for in terms of bringing that improvement. So where do you think our built environment is heading for, Andre? And on this theme, what is your major concern, but also let's hear your strongest ray of hope for a better Malta?
Our concern has been consistently, actually for a number of years now, on our need to align ourselves with the European market. So to be able to meet the standards of our European counterparts, we need to raise the bar. And this applies to all areas of industry, not just ours. But since we're speaking about the property market, our concern obviously focuses on this. And essentially what we are saying is that we have international obligations also at the European level to meet certain quality. We are also participating in the European market, particularly Jeff and others in the real estate market who are, the industry is also dependent on foreign direct investment. So we need a certain level of demand, and we need to meet that demand by providing quality. And the way to do this is to come to an agreement within the industry on the acceptable levels that we need to reach. And our drive over the past 14 years was to establish those standards. Now, at the moment, we're going, as Denise was just pointing out, we're going through a phase where these standards are in the process of being established finally. And in fact, Denise and I, a few hours ago, were on a meeting together precisely on this point with the ICC to discuss the detail of these standards. And so there is an effort that is underway to put together these standards that need to be there. You mentioned also issues like ESG and other sustainability measures that are coming to the fore, and obviously that is another priority we need to kind of meet. So if we speak about, for example, the real estate market, and we are looking at foreigners moving to Malta or coming back to Malta after COVID to gain employment locally, then obviously their culture and their way of life, they are basically used to living a certain quality of building, which they are unlikely to find at the moment here. So part of being attractive and competitive is also providing quality properties for the foreign labor force to be enticed to move here and to live here for as long as possible, obviously, because that we have a lot of turnaround in labor market, then obviously that creates problems for employers. So part of being competitive and having an attractive industry and economy is to provide quality buildings for the employees, but also for the companies to operate from. So if we have properties that are not flexible, not resilient, and unable to meet, changes in demand, as we've just experienced, sudden changes in demand like we had, or use as we had through COVID, and are difficult to adapt, then we have problems and inefficiencies in our property market. So the trend is to kind of raise the quality, but also design resilient and adaptive buildings for the future. So,
I mean, it's interesting you mentioning that, Andre, because obviously from an expat point of view, we've witnessed unprecedented increase. For example, seeing some statistics, we have around 100,000 expats in 2020, so it's around 20% of the population, up from 7% only in 2014. Around 25% per annum increase is no joke. So this sort of community needs to be said, but also I think the local community as well is. If we talk about office, and I connect with what Denise is saying, even from our own experience back at the office, sort of the function of the office before it used to be 5 days a week, a person sits in there and delivers through there. Now it's different. They're going to be looking for the office, obviously, as an area where you learn. If you're new and sort of you need to learn, you go to the office because you learn by doing. If you go to the office, you want to meet and collaborate because it's got certain convenience around being able to sort of like really tandem together. And also it serves other purpose of bond and building rapport between the connectedness between teams. So that's really going to probably continue to color the flexibility. Interesting point you raised, the flexibility of the adaptability of the buildings we're bringing in. And I'll pick again on the ESG front. But one area actually that could impact the ESG front is indeed the finance or the purse string. So I'll turn to George here. On a number of developments on the financing front. Some of them link also to the access to finance. So CBM policies come into play, but there's also certain EU regulation which also will be pushing, say, ESG and could color and could impact as well decision making from the point of view of access to finance. George, quick maybe around sort of a couple of items that you'd like to share today.
Thanks, David. I think what I have already heard today, I mean, Jeff has mentioned that there was a good success in the property sector, and that was supported by the financing sector, the financing industry, by banks. And now we're seeing that there is this flight for quality, flight for an improved product, which is also coming out of regulation that is coming through as well. However, as always, I mean, market needs to price that as well. So from an exit point of view, banks will always look at how sustainable, not just from an environmental point of view, but how sustainable the actual project is. On that front, there are two aspects, I believe, that we should be looking at. One is on a European and wider level, where the ESG front is now taking a more pronounced role. It has already started in certain markets, but it's coming more to the fore in the EU, where we will see some form of relief and some form of support for improved quality from an ESG point of view of the real estate space. That will probably result in it being termed as green loans, although I do not agree necessarily with just green, because people usually associate green with solar panels and plants. It's a wider aspect of ESG. It's also the actual rehabilitation and upgrading of existing dwellings, which will in turn be up to standards for today, that will provide what Denise as well mentioned, a more perhaps ambience in the office space that can be more comfortable for today's standards, and that relief from capital will probably make a difference in the cost of financing for the developer and eventually in the cost of financing for the ultimate end user. It's still at an early stage for us in the EU and us in Malta, but I think it's now past the point of no return, and it will come to us and it will come to shore very, very soon. On the local aspect, there is the update of the CBM Directive 16. Now, this will probably not be a good news in general, but following the strong support on the retail, and all banks were very active in the retail space in supporting first-time buyers and even second-time buyers in the past. As from the end of July, banks will need for category 2 customers, they call it, so the second-time buyers or the buy-to-lets, will be allowed to only lend up to 75. Now, if you go a couple of years back, actually, if you go 3 years back, it used to be 90, it went down to 85, now it's coming down to 75. this is more, I think it has more to do with perhaps the containment of the property prices rather than the actual quality of the property themselves. But that will also mean that investors will look at more value for money. And value for money will include ESG factors, I'm sure of that.
So interesting. I mean, you mentioned the fact that EU, I mean, there's a 750, I think, billion next generation EU fund premised on digital, premised on ESG. So there is real money being put behind it. Obviously, we need to see how it will trickle through the different structures. But this will drive changes either through imposition or through actually providing the finance for the change. And I think on the front that you mentioned on the demand factor by the change from the CBN policy, I mean that could impact demand, and it's sort of at a time when I know it's a burning question that a number of us were pinging through on our phones yesterday when we heard the news. I mean it's another demand factor at a time when maybe people are asking, okay, this grey listing, what could it mean? What could it spell for the island? And it's obviously it will be, and I'll hedge against and protect a bit the pressure on the panel here as you come in, only the very next day expecting to answer or possibly address what the impact would be. But I think just let's allow ourselves to take some first comments. Well, knowing I believe I can frame it in this way that the outcome of any event is in truth more defined by the response rather than the event itself. And so that really means that the impact will be very determined by the response that we will do or have as a country. So I think that sets the scene and allows then some latitude. But over to you, panel, openly. I mean, any initial reactions or thoughts in terms of the grey listing announcement of yesterday, or well, informal announcement?
I'm not going to give any much of insight as to the prediction of what will happen going forward. But I think what the past has taught us and what COVID has taught us is that, I don't know if you mentioned it, David, in the beginning, is that when we are more focused, we achieve more. We know what we need to work on, and we have always succeeded, I believe, on many aspects. The fact that what COVID managed to do, COVID-19, and how focused we were on doing the change, managing the change to digital transformation, was a result because we were focused, we had no option, we had to do that. And I think as a country, even as Maltese businesses have shown throughout history that we are very resilient. We are hard workers, and I think the secret is going to be to work really close with all together. So be it all the stakeholders, banks, institutions, authorities, businesses. So I think that's my 2 cents for it. Other than that, I have no idea what really is going to happen going forward. So
a clear message of let's rolling up our sleeves and coming together at this time. Though true, COVID does give us a clear analogy over there. There are people who mentioned that they made improvements in 7 months that they wouldn't have dreamt of in 7 years. So a very encouraging message over there. Denise, maybe Jeff, Andre. Yes, go ahead, Andre. I think Jeff was muted.
I have just one. As you rightly correctly pointed out, that it's more about the response than the actual outcome. And one risk that we can, or one negative response that we can get trapped into is being scared and not taking this as an opportunity to raise the standards. Because there's a possibility that one can say, listen, this is not the time, and because of perceived cost, and one can actually use this to drop the standards, to kind of stimulate activity within the industry and try to keep the flows of money going through the industry by dropping the standards. That is a risk. And I think we need to be careful not to fall into that trap. we should actually use this as an opportunity, and perhaps during COVID, we didn't perhaps grasp it well enough, but I think now maybe we should, and use it as an opportunity to rethink the industry. Earlier we were talking about the building regulation, but there's also the planning system we need to be looking at, and we need to kind of reconsider what it is, how we want our built environment to be over the next 20 years. We need to look, for example, at things like our tourism model. For example, are we still going to go for the cheaper kind of lower income, lower revenue generating tourism, or are we going for the higher end? We've been talking about this for a number of years now as a country, and we never actually decided what we want to do, because there were periods when we were talking about investing in high-end tourism, but then we were letting in tourists on low-cost flights and Airbnb. So, I mean, we need to kind of set a tone here. Where do we want to take this country, and how is the construction industry going to respond to that? So, these I think are the 2 points I think we need to be looking at over the next few months.
It's a discipline, the focus, and the action. You mentioned tourism, by the way. Just some stats. 2016, 400,000 tourists used private residence, private accommodation, so not sort of hotels, up to now nearly 800,000 in 2020. So from 4 million nights to 6 million nights. So look at what a push and demand that would have created for a different form of accommodation. So Jeff, maybe I know you wish to.
Yeah. Well, I tend to agree with both the guys over here. What I do, I mean, whenever a door closes, another door will open, and I agree. We need to look at opportunities, and I think we do need to work together as industries. For example, the real estate industry needs to work together. The construction industry needs to work together. And I think the only people that will be left behind are the ones that don't buckle up. They don't focus. They don't, we need to be professional companies today. I mean, for example, in my industry, we can no longer be taxi drivers and just drive people around. We need to up our game. We need to have standards. And I'll go back to that every time. I'm an ambassador, or whatever you want to call me, of standards. And whenever I'm in a meeting with an office, I always talk about giving the best service, exceptional service, doing your best for the customer. And that's the way. And if we can transform these ideas into, in the construction industry, the real estate industry, then I think if we all work together, yes, I mean, we will survive, and there will be more opportunities, and we'll find new ways to do business. And I mean, it's too early to talk about the impact of what's going to happen with the grey listing. I mean, let's say there's talk that some of the gaming companies might relocate some of their their head office people because of their standards, because they're on the stock market. So there might be some offices that are given up, but I'm sure we'll be able to replace them somehow. So I mean, like I said, I mean, there may be and may not be. So it's too early to actually predict what will happen in the next months, or 6 months, next quarter, or even next year. We just need to, work together and bond together and make sure that we get out of this as quickly as possible.
Let's raise the heat a bit, however, on this. So we mentioned standards. We mentioned standards. Yeah. We mentioned regulation, but then again, as was mentioned right at the start, we hardly have any data. So if you don't have data, how can you measure even where you?
There is data,
but yeah, but fair comment.
We don't get it. We don't get it. Only certain privileged people
populating the report which we pen every year. I mean, we've seen improvements, and there's much more data than when we started, but nevertheless, for the level of planning desires, for the level of interaction to look at supply, demand, and to really help the financiers, the developers, the investors, the users ultimately of such property, I think there's need of much more of data. There's need of, when we talk about these standards, are those standards that transparent? So do you see you know, would you see what that standard means? You buy an appliance, you see a rating. I mean, we have certain certifications, but is it, you know, but from what I hear, and then you will speak much more about it in detail, it's if we really want to be serious about it and we really want to use the pressure, because this is what we're doing here, we're using the pressure that some event like this could do to push that change towards Andres. You know, let's remain committed. Let's not sort of like actually quiver at the pressure and instead of pushing through, you know. So, you know, really anything, you know, how bold do we need to be? And do you think we're going to be that bold?
I think, if I may, we need to recognize who is doing a good job. So if we do not recognize who, I mean, I'm talking on developments here, who is building or giving any form of credit to someone who is building a good development and someone who is not, if ultimately they are rated through an EPC certificate, which has absolutely no value, then what are we saying? Basically what we would be saying is, listen, you can do whatever you want in your building. You're not going to get any better rate per square meter. And, you know, don't even bother. So I think the first step, as you mentioned, if you go and buy a simple washing machine, you know what rating you're going to get. And you know you're going to pay more because it's more energy efficient. Simple. Now, when we buy a property of 200, 300, whatever thousands, you get absolutely nothing. You don't know what rating your property has, except for the EPC, which has no value weighting whatsoever. So unless we're going, as I mentioned before, we have good properties, we definitely do, but we also have substandard. But how are we balancing the, not balancing, how are we distinguishing between one property and the other? When it comes to rate per square meter, there is no value being attributed to a better property. There is nothing that says, okay, so that guides a real estate agent that says, listen, if you have this, 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 and this, you are better off even in terms of energy consumption, sound insulation, thermal insulation, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole list that goes on, and we need to give credit where it is due, because we do. And ultimately, unless we give this credit and this recognition, we will not drive the change. They will remain good developments in isolation. And that is not what we want. If we want to really drive that change, if we want to make the change happen in the real estate market, to have better quality developments, because we do, and we deserve to have those better quality developments, better urban environment. But let's put a value to, let's give credit where it is due.
Andre, what would you add on that?
No, I agree with what Denise is saying. And one of the ways of doing it is through, well, it's more than one, actually. There's the regulation of design. So the way buildings are designed, because there is no, or the system of permitting does not contemplate assessment in these terms. You know, it becomes an afterthought, which frequently is just that. It's very often it's forgotten. And then there is also the role of the real estate market. So Jeff and his colleagues. So one of the purposes actually of DPC, which is completely lost in our system, is that the rating should be advertised in the listings.
Yeah.
And which is not being done here. So if you go to Paris or London or whatever, and you look at the shop windows of the real estate shops, you can see the rating. It's mandatory at law to advertise the rating. While here, it's just something that you do as a tick box for the notary to register the contract. So the purpose of the EPC is to inform the purchaser on what they're buying. That's the purpose of the EPC. While here, it's just a bureaucratic nuisance after the purchasing decision has been made. When it's too late, the whole purpose of the EPC would be lost. So there are immediate things that can happen. I mean, the energy performance regulations are already in place in Malta, but there's no system for having them factored in and approved, and having the drawings prepared by architects assessed in terms of these regulations before the building starts. That's a bit before the work starts. So there is no such process yet. And this is why we have been pushing for a reform, because the systems that we have in place are archaic. They are not responsive to this situation. And I would like to touch upon a point which you mentioned earlier, David, on the issue of data. One of the problems we have in our planning system is that our planning documents, the strategic planning documents like SPED and local plans, are outdated or inadequate. One of the difficulties, one of the failures, in fact, of the planning authority is that it doesn't keep our built environment under review constantly. So when it comes to updating these plans, it needs to go through a very arduous task of gathering the data to be able to undertake this exercise, rather than keeping the data continuously updated to be able to be adaptive and respond immediately to a market change or shift. So if we had a crisis, if we have a shift in, I don't know, the typology of the industries that we have, for example, we might have a sudden change like we've had with gaming, for instance, which was quite sudden relatively. Then the planning authority wasn't unable to respond immediately to this change. So this data gathering should be carrying out in a systematic manner, also from public entities, not just from the private sector.
So I mean, when you mentioned earlier, 14 years to see certain regulations come to fruition, we see the different actors and stakeholders all pointing out aspects of the market, which are kinks in the system, which are not yet addressed. Why are these changes going to happen, or why are you more convinced that these changes could happen in the near future? Is there some real ray of hope that makes you more confident, Andrea, Jeff, Denise, George, to see this market address these long-standing issues?
If I may, on this one, I think we need to stop at just looking at regulation. Where we usually fail is in the next steps, which to me are the implementation of those regulations, the education side of the market, and what I believe as well, facilitation in the sense. And when I say facilitation, I mean that the ultimate market price, if it is not being factored in the open market, then there need to be incentives to support either the developer or the acquirer. So unless we move on from just the regulation aspect to ensure that there is the implementation, I agree with Andrea on the EPC. I think the EPC is not good enough. I think we need much more better certifications than that, and there are international certifications on that front. Then the education piece, because there needs to be the message needs to pass on why it is important to have certain standards. At times we're just price focused, and if the market is not adapting to that in terms of price, then we need to help the developer in terms of its costs, and we need to help the end user in terms of the price. I think that to me when we can really see this change happening.
So you're seeing that facilitation to get that behavioral change to come through. Just a small side note before continuing the conversation, just an invitation to any participants who would like to put forward a Q&A in the Q&A tool, so that we can pick up any of your questions as we come up to the hour. I think building on what you were sharing, George, and the rest of the team, I'll park aside, the grey listing is another factor affecting demand and even supply, because obviously it affects both the confidence to commit to supply, and it affects also maybe the confidence, or could affect the confidence to come into the island or maybe to grow and invest. But that is what it could have. At the same time, before the grey listing happened, we were sort of quite commenting on the performance early on right at the start, and how it appeared to be pretty resilient as a market. As you know, so your outlook over there, Jeff, and I did ask, but I don't know how much we picked on. Your outlook over there, was it similarly, at least barring, leave the greatest thing for now, but was it similarly quite a confident view across all segments? Or that's up here.
Are you talking about the market, how it was affected? Well, no, rental market went down by easily a good 40%, 30%. Only
but
due
in
to
terms
the
of
fact,
where it's going, sort of like, I mean, now this the outlook now in 2021, 2022.
outlook now is that we're seeing a huge surge of people coming in. We're seeing huge demand. I have agents running around with companies looking for blocks of apartments because they're bringing more staff into Malta. We're seeing quite a good vibe. We're feeling the market. It's coming back. Maybe I don't think it will come back as strong as it was right away, but we are feeling. It's like I said before. We have what we know of around 700 people that we're looking to hopefully accommodate over the next 2-3 months, and people are coming in now. Now this month, next week, the week after. So our agents are very busy, and we have over 50 agents in letting. Full-time agents, and I mean we need to keep them busy, so it's a good sign.
So if you're seeing, so let's say that the and it does mirror with the international trend. So you're seeing it come back across the different segments you're mentioning residential. If we then stop and think, imagine a scenario. Let's start to do some hypotheses here. Imagine a scenario whereby that the growth in the population size. So I'm just mentioned earlier on, 100,000. We continue to grow at such a stage earlier on in preparation for this conversation we're talking, and I remember Andrea's reaction to it. So, okay, now where does this demographic take us? And if we just merely continue just to supply the apartments or the real estate, more the hotels, just continue to build. I mean, the product in itself, overall, the experience actually of the worker, the resident, the traveler, the visitor. I mean, what's being done on that? How is it being cared for and curated?
You're talking about the service they're given?
I'm actually talking about maybe Andre as well is thinking about the overall experience. So if all of us look at, if the investor look at my block that I'm building, the hoteliers looking at the hotel he's bringing to the market, and we continue to attract, and we continue to attract more and more. So you can imagine the density continuing. So at the end of the day, is there a tipping point whereby the overall experience becomes then or hits a sort of diminishing side of the curve?
It can be lopsided because if the construction isn't up to the standard that if we're giving a great service and then the construction or the owner of the property lets down the buyer or the tenant, then obviously standards, if they're mixed up. I mean, that is one of the things we do need to work on, is coming together and saying, this is Malta, this is what we need to offer as a product, from the real estate agent to the construction to the architects, and that's what we should be talking about. And these discussions need to be, we need to throw down brainstorming and see how we can, build that great product. So when people come, they get the best service, the best experience. You mentioned it yourself.
Andre, do you echo with that?
I think that we need to take a wider view of what we mean by product. It's not just the flat or the villa, it's also the urban space. So if approaching your office or going back home, the experience is terrible because of the unsightliness, the so-called uglification, the traffic congestion, the whole experience is unpleasant, then that is going to have an impact on our quality of life as well, and on, again, the competitiveness if we're looking at ourselves as a market. So, I mean, we need to be looking at the public realm as well, and this is one of the failures that we have. So the public realm is completely ignored. So we can have the best buildings, build the best buildings, in Europe, but if we're not focusing on the way they interact with each other, and the frontages and the public space itself is left to chance, then we're going to have a poor quality built environment anyway.
There seems to be a lot of enthusiasm, or a lot of, let's put it that way, vocalization of the need to come together. And I think that's great. That's encouraging. It's in the execution where we need to see that we will follow through on this. And in fact, for example, there's a comment, I believe there's a comment being put through in terms of, in enforcement, unfortunately, there's that feel that it's not a level playing field. So, one of the aspects of regulation is, would regulation just, result in more regulation affecting the smaller, but maybe not leaving or not roping in, or not treating fairly all participants and all players. And I think this thing of standards is something which as a country, our promise, to build on Jeff's point, of our promises, and we need to be clear on what our promise is one where you're going to get certain standards delivered and equitably across that consistent metric. I think that's something which will inspire confidence across the board, locally and internationally. I mean, even we would want to live in a society like that. So it's, again, maybe I might ask is where's this change going to come from? What's going to change to make this which we all wish, happen?
Dave, if I may, to continue on the previous point a little bit, I wear many hats, so I'm talking here as I can be a contractor, a developer, but also a hotelier. So we have to, which we're tying on to what Andrea mentioned and also Jeff, we really have to seriously think about Product Malta and what we really want to sell as Product Malta. We cannot market mass and also market high-end at the same time. You can market them at the same time, but in different ways and in different areas. So, what I wanted to mention is that we need to balance it, going back on the construction and development. We need to balance the urban environment with our natural environment. So yes, we have to safeguard with all we have our little natural environment. So we must protect it at all costs, but at the same time, look at our built environment. This is ultimately where we live, our roads, our streetscapes, our communities. It's where our children ultimately go out to play when there's no COVID, obviously, but we have to project, plan for, I'm not going to say forward planning, Andrea, we have to plan for open spaces, proper open spaces, not just a piazza which is hard landscaped. That is not what our children want. Our children want the greenery, but it goes back to planning policies and how we're going to integrate those open spaces in our communities, and it goes on to small things. A walk around the block or around the neighborhood. Is there a proper pavement? Can I go and walk without falling down? These are all part of our Product Malta. It isn't just how many belvederes we will build. These are a lot of small things that will make Product Malta what we really want. But first we need to define what we want, and the real estate market depends heavily on that, what we want to sell, who are we attracting, both in terms of long-term guests, which are our tenants, which are our investors who are renting our properties, but also our short-term clients, which are our 3-night, 5-night guests, really. But first we need to define what we really want.
And actually, to do that, to define what you really want, it also depends on even interrelationship with other sectors. And I mean, it's a common dialogue, by the way, even in other sectors like financial services. There's a discussion in terms of also being clear on the nature of the financial services operators and operations which we wish to attract to our island, and which are the areas we would like to compete in. So in other sectors as well, I mean, gaming, all the sectors are facing the same, a need to be clear on what is the offer that Malta can give to the respective sectors, and then fulfill on that promise through the experience when that operator lands on our shores, or a local operator continues to invest and grow. So this clarity and this need to come and see the end-to-end reality is really one which I hope what you were saying, all of you today on this call, and maybe I'll start to wrap up with this 6 o'clock. I'll take maybe an extra 5-10 minutes to just bring it to a wrap, and a final question to each one of the participants. But I think if the encouraging words shared are actually, the sentiment of the broader community and are actually implemented, then we could be very much on the right path, because we talked about the right standards, clarity of the brand promise. And let's say, as a final word to each of the participants, as we look ahead on the property market, what would you share to anybody who's looking at the property market in terms of next steps? Any final thoughts, property market for the next couple of years?
Okay. Well, the real estate market is still a very strong market. I think the last research, and this is something I wanted to actually tell you, Dave, is that I think as a company we spend 40 to 50,000 on market research. So mystery shopping, understanding customer behaviors, basically what people are buying. We mystery shop our agents, we mystery shop our competition's agents to understand what they are doing and where we can fill the gap in our service. So that's something that as a company we feel we're not only doing, because when we look at improving our service, I like to look at improving the industry rather than looking to, let's say, fill my pockets by giving a better service. We like to, at Remax, we like to always be number one, but always do it as if we are running the industry, for example. But what I can say is, from a property market point of view, we have, the market is still strong. It's still a very good investment. Obviously, we play day by day at the moment with what is going on, but we don't see any major issues right now. So yeah, I believe that we see things looking good, but obviously we cannot predict what's going to happen in the next 2 years with the gray listing. So that's the situation at the moment. So we need to just touch wood and hope everything goes the right way from that perspective.
Thanks, Jeff. George, maybe turning over to you.
Well, I think the property market has performed and will continue to perform. We all love property. What I think we need to be careful of is that the performance is not necessarily the one of the past. So I think in general, we will come together, like Denise said, and probably perform better, not necessarily just on price.
Okay, so not just
on price. Can I just
price.
say one thing?
Go, Jeff.
Well, if you consider that Malta, 88% of Maltese are homeowners, that is huge. You don't have many countries where you have 88% of them own their own home, and then we have about 17% that own a second home. So that is huge for a market to have, and obviously that helps us sustain the market, because people are buying. They love buying. Parents love helping their kids buy their property, so I believe, we believe as Maltese of the brick and mortar, so I believe the property market will always be a strong pillar of the economy.
With an additional, and George's point on the additional focus on quality is an interesting one. Denise, and then wrap up, Andrea. Denise?
They really took all what I had to say, because I was going to mention I know it is 82% are homeowners, but anyway, it doesn't make much of a difference between 82 and 88%. And I was going to say that the property market locally has always been very resilient. So I believe that it will continue to be resilient, but we have to change our game. We have to change our tactics. We have to change the way we have to use it as an opportunity because there is an outcry and we deserve to have that change. So we need to as I mentioned before, I'm not going to go through the whole details, but there is an opportunity and we need to rise to that occasion to change our property types and our urban environment and where we live.
So adapting, seizing the opportunity to adapt and to take it to the next level. That's
I
Denise.
don't think it's impossible. So I truly believe that we can do it.
Andre, do you share that sentiment, and will you take the wrap?
What I see for the coming years is a process of renewal within the industry. I think it's time for it, and it's becoming ever more expected of us to kind of change the way we're doing things. One of the possible scenarios with the grey listing is that we might have a drop in foreign demand, so we might need to change our market base as well, or like consider a different approach to our investment. So, but definitely we need to kind of rethink our model, and both us as industry players, but also the public sector needs to be involved in this renewal process.
So thank you, Andre, Denise, George, Jeff. Thanks, MBN, and the whole team behind the scenes for bringing all this together. It was quite an interesting conversation. It was needed. It's been a bit of a while since we've been discussing property market, and also at a very timely moment. May the resolve and may the keen intent to raise the standards, raise property in Malta in terms of its brand promise come to fruition. May we have a better brand, may we live in a better built environment, and may we all maybe raise our own ask from a civic point of view of what we want our island to represent out there in built up environment and beyond. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed the session.